local townsfolk began spotting bobcat kittens playing at the edge of the forest. Some called for trapping, warning that the wild cats would grow into a threat, while others argued they should be left in peace. Ethan Carter, a retired wildlife veterinarian, lived by one simple rule: let wild things be wild. But that was until one morning, when a bobcat kitten, no bigger than a house cat, stepped from the brush. It approached him without fear, looked him straight in the eye, and then turned, walking away. Every few steps it paused and looked back, as if asking him to follow. The tiny animal led him away from the trail, deeper into the woods. There was urgency in the kitten's movements that made the old man's heart race. It led him to a hollow beneath an ancient oak tree. He soon discovers he's been led to a secret. A mother bobcat is in the middle of a difficult labor, and without intervention, both she and her kitten will die. The choice he makes in that moment will not only determine the fate of this animal family, but will ultimately transform an entire community. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The morning mist hung low over Cedar Ridge, Tennessee, clinging to the pine trees like cotton caught on thorns. Ethan Carter pulled his worn flannel jacket tighter as he walked the familiar trail behind his cabin, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp April air. At 72, his joints protested the early morning walks, but after 40 years as a wildlife veterinarian, the call of the forest was stronger than any ache in his bones. Cedar Ridge had been buzzing with talk for weeks now. Bobcat sightings at the forest's edge had divided the town of 800 souls into two camps. At Murphy's General Store, Frank Henderson held court near the coffee pot, warning anyone who'd listen about the dangers of wild predators so close to town. "Mark my words," Frank had said just yesterday, his weathered face stern with conviction. "Those cats will grow bold. Today, they're playing in the shadows. Tomorrow, they're after someone's dog, or worse, a child." On the other side of the argument stood Martha Brennan, the town librarian, who insisted the bobcats had as much right to the land as anyone else. "They were here first," she'd argue, her gray hair bouncing with indignation. "We're the ones who pushed into their territory." Ethan had stayed silent during these debates, nursing his black coffee and keeping his thoughts to himself. In his experience, nature had its own way of maintaining balance. Interference, whether well-meaning protection or aggressive elimination, rarely ended well. He'd seen enough in his career to know that sometimes the kindest thing was to let wild things be wild. But this morning, as he rounded the bend where the trail dipped toward Willow Creek, everything he believed about non-interference would be tested. A movement caught his eye. Small, uncertain, wrong somehow. There, stumbling through the undergrowth with none of the fluid grace typical of its species, was a bobcat kitten. No bigger than a house cat, its spotted coat was matted with dew, and its oversized paws seemed to tangle with every step. Ethan froze. In 4 decades of working with wildlife, he'd learned to read animal behavior like others read books. This kitten should have bolted at the sight of him. Instead, it stopped, tilted its head, and stared with amber eyes that held no fear, only curiosity. "Well, I'll be," Ethan whispered, remaining perfectly still. The kitten took a tentative step forward, then another. Ethan's heart raced as the small creature approached, close enough now that he could see the white spots behind its ears, the tufts of fur that would one day become pronounced ear tips. When it reached his boots, the kitten did something that defied every natural instinct. It rubbed against them, just once, like a house cat greeting its owner. Then, as suddenly as it had approached, The kitten scampered back toward the forest, pausing every few feet to look back at Ethan, as if checking to see if he was following. "You want me to come with you?" Ethan murmured, knowing how absurd he sounded. But the kitten's behavior was so deliberate, so purposeful, that he found himself taking a step forward. The kitten led him off the trail, through a thicket of mountain laurel that grabbed at his jacket, over a fallen log covered in soft moss. His arthritis complained with every awkward step, but something in the kitten's urgent backward glances kept him moving. They arrived at an ancient oak tree, its base hollowed out by time and weather into a natural den. The kitten disappeared inside, and Ethan heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold. A low, pained breathing, labored and wet. Dropping to his knees despite the protest from his joints, Ethan peered into the hollow. His eyes took a moment to adjust to the darkness, and when they did, his breath caught in his throat. A mother bobcat lay on her side, her flanks heaving with exhaustion. Around her, 3 tiny kittens nursed weakly, their bodies no bigger than Ethan's fist. But it was what he saw next that made his veterinary instincts kick in with an urgency he hadn't felt since retirement. The mother was still in labor, and something was terribly wrong. The partially delivered kitten was stuck, its mother too weak to complete the birth. Ethan could see the tiny form, could see the mother's futile efforts to deliver it. Without intervention, both mother and kitten would die. "Oh, sweetheart," Ethan breathed, his mind racing. He was no longer in a sterile clinic with assistants and equipment. He was alone in the woods with a wild predator who, despite her weakness, could still inflict serious damage if she felt threatened. But the mother's eyes, when they met his, held something he'd seen before in countless animals, a desperate plea for help that transcended species. She knew. Somehow she knew he could help. Moving with the slow, deliberate movements he'd perfected over decades, Ethan reached into his jacket pocket. By pure habit, he still carried a few basic supplies: clean handkerchief, small flashlight, pocket knife. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. "Easy, Mama," he crooned in the voice he'd used to calm thousands of frightened animals. "I'm going to help you, but you have to trust me." The mother's eyes never left his face as he reached into the den. His hands, which had started to shake with age in recent years, were steady now, guided by muscle memory and urgent purpose. Gently, so gently, he helped guide the stuck kitten, using techniques he'd learned in rural Kentucky where fancy equipment was a luxury and skill had to suffice. The mother bobcat's breathing grew more labored, and for a moment, Ethan feared he was too late. Then, with a final, careful maneuver, the kitten was free. It lay still in his hands, unmoving. Without thinking, Ethan began the delicate process of clearing its airways, rubbing its tiny body with the handkerchief to stimulate breathing. Seconds felt like hours until finally, impossibly, the kitten drew a shuddering breath and let out a weak mewl. Ethan placed the newborn next to its mother, watching as she summoned the last of her strength to lick it clean, her rough tongue working with determined purpose. The kitten responded, its cries growing stronger, and soon it was crawling toward the warmth of its siblings. The mother bobcat looked at Ethan then, really looked at him, and in that gaze was something he'd rarely seen from a wild animal. Recognition, gratitude, trust. She blinked slowly, the universal cat sign of contentment and acceptance, before turning her attention back to her newborns. Ethan backed away from the den, his knees creaking as he stood. The original kitten who had led him here sat watching from a nearby stump, as if standing guard. When Ethan met its gaze, the kitten blinked the same slow blink its mother had given him. "You knew I'd help, didn't you?" Ethan said softly. "Somehow, you knew." The walk back to his cabin felt like a dream. Ethan's mind reeled with what had just happened. In all his years working with wildlife, he'd never experienced anything quite like this. A wild animal actively seeking human help for another creature. He told no one at first, keeping the morning's events locked in his heart like a precious secret. But secrets in a small town have a way of revealing themselves. Within days, more bobcat sightings were reported. Tom Bradley claimed he'd seen the whole family, mother and kittens, playing near the old Gibson barn. Sarah Mitchell swore she'd spotted them drinking from her pond at dawn. The town meetings grew more heated. Frank Henderson brought in his nephew from Knoxville, a young man named Derek who fancied himself a trapper. "It's simple," Derek announced at the town hall, his voice carrying the confidence of youth. "We set traps along the forest edge, catch them before they become a problem. Clean and simple." Clean and simple? Martha Brennan stood up, her face flushed with anger. "You're talking about killing a mother and her babies." "I'm talking about protecting this community," Derek shot back. "These aren't pets, ma'am. They're wild predators." Ethan sat in the back row, his jaw clenched. The image of the mother bobcat, weak and vulnerable, trusting him with her life and the lives of her kittens, burned in his mind. When Mayor Roberts asked if anyone else had something to say, Ethan almost stood. Almost. But what could he say that wouldn't sound like the ramblings of a sentimental old man? The meeting ended with no resolution, but Ethan overheard Derek talking to Frank and a few others near the door. "Official or not, those cats are a danger. A few of us are going to handle it ourselves." That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He stood at his kitchen window looking out at the dark forest, remembering the weight of that newborn kitten in his hands, the trust in the mother's eyes. By morning, he'd made his decision. He began walking the forest edges at dawn and dusk, the times when trappers would be most active. On his third patrol, he found them. Steel jaw traps, cunningly hidden along game trails. His old hands worked quickly, disabling the mechanisms and hurling them into the deep ravine where Willow Creek ran fast and deep. Word spread that someone was sabotaging the traps. Derek was furious, Frank suspicious. At Murphy's General Store, conversation stopped when Ethan entered. He didn't care. Each morning, he checked the den from a respectful distance, relief flooding through him when he counted all the kittens tumbling in play while their mother watched from the shadows. 2 weeks passed in this tense dance. Then, one evening, as the sun painted the sky purple and gold, Ethan heard voices near the old oak. His blood ran cold as he recognized Derek's voice. "The tracks lead right here. This is their den." Ethan moved faster than he had in years, crashing through the underbrush with no thought for stealth. He burst into the clearing just as Derek was positioning a trap at the den's entrance. "Stop," Ethan commanded, his voice carrying an authority that made the younger man pause. Derek straightened, his face hardening. "So it was you. I should have known. Sentimental old fool." "That mother has 5 kittens in there," Ethan said, stepping between Derek and the den. "Kittens that won't survive without her." "That's the point," Derek said coldly. "Better to deal with them now than when they're full-grown problems." Frank and 2 other men emerged from the trees, rifles in hand. Ethan's heart pounded, but he didn't move. "You set that trap," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "And you're not just killing a bobcat, you're killing trust. That mother trusted me when she was at her most vulnerable. She let me help her bring life into this world. She chose to raise her young here because she thought it was safe. You'll have to go through me first." "Ethan," Frank said, his voice almost pitying, "you don't understand the danger." "I understand more than you know," Ethan interrupted. "I spent 40 years working with wildlife. You know what I learned? The real danger isn't from the animals. It's from fear. Fear makes us do terrible things, things we can't take back." He looked at each man in turn. "That mother could have attacked me when I helped deliver her kitten. She was weak, in pain, vulnerable, but she could have lashed out. Instead, she trusted. A wild animal trusted a human stranger. Do you understand how rare that is? How precious?" The clearing fell silent except for the evening birds beginning their twilight songs. Then from the den came a sound, the weak mewl of a kitten. It was followed by another, then another, a chorus of young life. Derek's hand on the trap loosened slightly. You helped deliver her kittens?" Ethan nodded. "One was stuck. Both mother and baby would have died without help. Her kitten, one of those playing by the forest edge that everyone's been seeing, came and got me, led me right to her." "That's impossible," Frank said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Ethan challenged. "How many impossible things happen every day that we miss because we're too busy being afraid?" A movement caught everyone's attention. The mother bobcat emerged from the den, her spotted coat gleaming in the fading light. She should have run, should have attacked, should have done anything but what she did. She sat down, just out of reach, and looked directly at Ethan. Her kittens tumbled out behind her, 5 balls of spotted fur wrestling in the leaves. The men stood frozen, rifles hanging useless at their sides. The mother bobcat's gaze moved from Ethan to each of them in turn, assessing, measuring. Then she turned and walked calmly back into the forest, her kittens scrambling to follow except for one, the original kitten who had led Ethan to the den. It lingered for a moment, looking at the gathered humans with those intelligent amber eyes, before bounding after its family. Derek dropped the trap. It hit the ground with a metallic clang that seemed to break whatever spell had fallen over the clearing. I've never seen anything like that," he whispered. Frank lowered his rifle completely. They weren't afraid. They weren't aggressive. They just were. Ethan felt his knees go weak with relief. They know the difference between a threat and a neighbor. Maybe we should learn the same. The story of that evening spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire, growing with each telling. Some embellished it beyond recognition, but the core truth remained. The bobcats weren't the monsters fear had painted them to be. The town council voted to designate the forest edge as a wildlife corridor, prohibiting traps and hunting within a mile of the town limits. Derek, surprisingly, became one of the measure's strongest supporters, though he never quite met Ethan's eyes when they passed at Murphy's. As spring turned to summer, the bobcat family thrived. Ethan saw them occasionally on his morning walks, the mother teaching her kittens to hunt, to climb, to be the wild creatures they were meant to be. She never approached him again, maintaining the proper boundary between wild and tame. But sometimes, when their paths crossed at a distance, she would pause and give him that slow, deliberate blink. Martha Brennan started an educational program at the library about living alongside wildlife. Frank Henderson, of all people, donated the funds for informational signs along the trail. "Figure if they're going to be neighbors," he grumbled. "Folks should know how to be good ones." One autumn morning, as the leaves painted the forest in shades of gold and crimson, Ethan sat on a bench overlooking Willow Creek. His joints were particularly stiff that day, winter's approach making itself known in his bones. He was contemplating heading back when he heard a rustle in the underbrush. The original Kitten, though hardly a kitten anymore, emerged from the bushes. It had grown into a magnificent young bobcat, its coat thick and healthy, its movements sure and graceful. It sat at the far end of the bench, not close enough to touch, but closer than any wild bobcat should be comfortable with. They sat together in companionable silence, the old man and the young bobcat, watching the creek bubble over ancient stones. After a few minutes, the bobcat stood, stretched in that impossibly fluid way cats do, and disappeared back into the forest. Ethan smiled, pulling his jacket closer against the chill. "Thank you," he called softly to the trees, not sure if he was thanking the bobcat or something larger. The forest itself, perhaps, for reminding him that trust, once given and honored, creates bonds that transcend the boundaries we think divide us. As he made his way slowly back to his cabin, Ethan thought about the town meetings, the fear, the anger, and how it had all transformed into something else. Understanding, respect, coexistence. It hadn't been easy or quick, but then the most important changes never were. That evening, as he sat by his fireplace with a cup of tea and his old tabby cat, Ethan picked up the phone and called his daughter in Nashville. "Dad?" she answered, surprise in her voice at the unexpected call. "Just wanted to tell you about something that happened here," he said, settling back in his chair. "About trust and fear, and how sometimes the most shocking thing you can find is that there's more connecting us to this world than separating us from it." As he told the story, his cat purring in his lap and the fire crackling warmly, Ethan could have sworn he heard, carried on the evening wind, the distant call of a bobcat, wild and free and unafraid. The forest had taught Cedar Ridge a lesson that year, delivered by an unlikely messenger with spotted fur and amber eyes. It was a simple truth, really, as most important truths are. When we choose trust over fear, when we see neighbors instead of threats, when we remember that we share this earth rather than own it, that's when the truly shocking becomes beautifully possible. And in a small town in Tennessee, where the forest meets the fields and wild things still roam, that possibility lived on in the space between wild and tame. Fear and trust, them and us. A space bridged by one tiny bobcat kitten who knew somehow that an old veterinarian's hands could save a life, and in doing so, transform an entire community's heart.